Some love stories don't come with wedding rings, aisles, or even a single photograph to remember them by. And yet, they endure through a glance, a quiet gesture, or in the kind of silence the world never gets to hear. This is the story of Katharine Hepburn, a woman who never believed in marriage, and Spencer Tracy, a man who never broke his vow. They loved each other for 27 years. No commitments, no titles, but never once did they leave one another. And if true love does exist, perhaps it lies somewhere between the lights of a film set the hush of a morning tea and a man who never said, "I love you," yet always left his heart behind. Some women are born to follow a man quietly to wait in his shadow. Katharine Hepburn was never one of them. From an early age, her mother, a fierce suffragist, taught her, "You don't need to wait for anyone to become extraordinary. If something stands in your way, walk through it." And Katharine did just that. She walked through expectations, through stardom, through loneliness, towards something she herself couldn't explain: love for a man who already belonged to someone else. When she met Spencer Tracy, she was already Katharine Hepburn, the woman who wore pants on set, who never flattered the press, who was once called box office poison, but returned like a general leading a victorious army. He, on the other hand, was one of America's most revered actors, famous magnetic private, and married. She didn't know the exact moment she fell in love with him. She only remembered the screen test when he looked at her and said, "I'm afraid you'll be taller than me on screen." And she smiled, replying, "Then we'll just cut off the top of my head." Their love didn't begin with a promise. It didn't have music swelling in the background, nor a moonlit walk. It began the way they both were quiet, pragmatic, and a little imperfect. Spencer never divorced, and Katharine, the woman who never believed in marriage, chose to love a man who could never love her in public. They starred together in 9 films, moving side by side on screen, as though destiny had written it. But behind the lens there were no weddings, no hand-holding at parties, no declarations in the tabloids. Their love had no name. And yet for 27 years, over a quarter of a century, she remained by his side. No one knew what they called each other when the doors closed. They only knew that when Spencer Tracy was hospitalized, Katharine was always the first to arrive. When he battled depression, insomnia, or alcohol, she was the one keeping him company. And when they acted, audiences couldn't quite tell where the character ended and real love began. Some love doesn't need definitions. It only needs to be lived long enough, real enough, and quietly enough that no one else can intrude. Katharine once said, "I never asked him for anything, not once." Perhaps because she understood true love doesn't start with holding on. It begins with accepting the part of someone the rest of the world rejects. Hollywood in the 1940s was radiant, a stage that never dimmed. Everyone lived for applause, for magazine covers, for the kind of fame that roared in full theaters. But Spencer Tracy never lived for the spotlight. He lived in shadows, in sleepless nights, and in a promise he never dared to break. He would not divorce the woman with whom he had 2 children. Like Katharine, Spencer grew up in a strict household, Catholic conservative, where marriage was sacred and irrevocable. His wife, Louise Treadwell, was the first to believe in his talent. She had walked with him through the hardest years. But fame changed everything. Love was no longer enough to keep them together. They lived apart, walked parallel paths, but never signed the papers out of religion, history, and maybe gratitude. When Katharine entered Spencer's life, she didn't try to replace anything. She didn't ask him to leave his family. She never appeared with him at award shows, never held his hand in public. She chose to stay quietly behind the scenes, like a shadow that couldn't be replaced. Everyone in Hollywood knew, but no one spoke of it. There were no scandals, no photographers trailing them. Perhaps it was out of respect for Spencer. Or perhaps for Katharine, the woman strong enough to love without needing to possess. Spencer was not an easy man. He drank. He kept people at arm's length. He fell into long silences, deep depressions. But Katharine never left. She once said he was a wonderful man, even when he didn't want to be. Once, when Spencer was hospitalized, someone saw Katharine sitting for hours in the hallway, legs resting on a small suitcase, saying nothing. A nurse asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" She smiled gently. "No, just waiting for someone to wake up. That's all." Love doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs a hallway, a wooden chair, and someone who stays day after day waiting for the person they love to come back from the dark. Spencer understood. Though he never said, "I love you" in public, though he never introduced her as a partner, he gave her something else: the screen, the place where he came most alive. She was his perfect partner in every scene. She knew the rhythm of his breathing. They rarely rehearsed. One glance was enough to know when to speak, when to pause. On screen, they weren't acting anymore. They loved like the world didn't exist, but also like the world was too wide for them to ever fully belong to one another. Cinema has a way of capturing what words cannot. A look, a breath, a stillness between two people who truly understand each other, those things can't be faked. When Katharine and Spencer made Woman of the Year in 1942, it was their first time on screen together. From the opening scene, he looked at her as if he'd known her in a previous life. And she, without artifice, simply stepped into the frame, and suddenly, something rare was born. The film was a romantic comedy about two accomplished people who struggled with love. They fell for each other, then collided, then tried to find a way back. But the story wasn't what moved audiences. It was the way they spoke to each other, without needing to explain a thing. Viewers watched them like they were watching something real. There was no hero above the heroine, no girl waiting to be rescued, no man giving orders. Just two proud souls, sharp, confident, who somehow found gentleness in one another. After Woman of the Year, they became Hollywood's beloved pair, Adam's Rib Pat and Mike Desk Set. Each film felt like another chapter in their unnamed love. In Adam's Rib, they played a married couple, both lawyers opposing each other in court. On screen, they battled fiercely, but between takes, they looked at each other with a tenderness no script could match. In Pat and Mike, she was a brilliant athlete, he a gruff coach. The banter was fast and funny, but beneath it was something sincere. In Desk Set, they talked about computers and books, but every line felt like it had been lived before. People in the business would say, "They're the perfect pair." Katharine never confirmed it. She didn't need to. The truth didn't require explanation. On screen, they kissed, they argued, they reconciled. Their love felt grown, grounded, never performative. Off-screen, there were no wedding photos, no diamond ring, no anniversaries. But if someone asked, did anyone understand Spencer Tracy better than Katharine Hepburn, the quiet man himself might simply nod. Because some love doesn't need a marriage bed. It just needs a script, a camera, and someone watching from the wings, eyes filled with a world only two people know. Hollywood never sleeps. It thrives on spectacle stories told 1,000 times, beautiful couples, and scandalous affairs. But theirs was a story no one dared to touch. Not because it was hidden, but because everyone knew it was too sacred to speak aloud. For 27 years, Katharine and Spencer remained side by side, but never under the same roof. They had separate homes, separate lives. But if he needed her, she was there. If he fell ill, she was the first to arrive. If he sank into one of his dark spells, she sat with him quietly. They never walked into a party hand in hand. They never took vacations as a couple. They were never seen embracing on a beach like lovers in a movie. But she had a key to his home, and he had a chair waiting at her table. It was the kind of love not meant for show. It didn't crave validation, didn't move quickly, didn't need to be defined by documents. It lived in gestures, in her reading the paper while he sipped coffee, in her wiping his windows on rainy days because he hated the sound. Once, when he was writhing in pain from alcohol-induced illness, she stayed with him for 48 hours without sleep. A housekeeper said she didn't leave, not even for an hour. When he finally opened his eyes and saw her slumped in the chair, he whispered, "Kate, you're still here?" She smiled, eyes closed. "I never left." She never did. A part of her heart lived in that house with the man who never called her wife, but never let her go. Katharine once said, "I never needed Spencer to say he loved me. I only needed to know that when he was hurting, I was the one he reached for. For others, that might not be enough, but for her, it was everything." And in a city that screams for attention, their love whispered. So softly the world had to hold its breath to hear it. Once a young reporter, bold enough to ask what others wouldn't, looked at Katharine and said, "Did you ever wish Spencer Tracy were entirely yours?" She paused for just a moment, then smiled gently and replied, "I think he was mine. Just not in the way you're used to." Katharine never envied Spencer's wife. She understood that Louise was part of the life he couldn't shed, and she never tried to make him choose. For many, love is a battlefield, a fight to conquer, to win. But for Katharine, love wasn't about winning every war. It was about knowing when to stop so that the one you love doesn't lose himself. Spencer wasn't only a movie star. He was a father to a deaf son, a husband who never signed the papers, a man whose values were rooted in a world that no longer existed. He carried weights that Katharine couldn't lift, but she never walked away. She just made sure she wasn't another burden on his shoulders. No one knew how many times she had to swallow the urge to take his hand in public. How many red carpets she walked alone, smiling, as if she needed no one beside her. How many nights she sat alone in her living room, hearing the radio announce Spencer's awards, unable to send flowers, unable to cheer him on like other women might. Their love didn't have declarations or diamonds, but it had silence shaped like sacrifice. She once said, "Spencer was the first man who made me want to be soft." And maybe that was more sacred than a wedding. For a woman like Katharine, who had walked through storms alone, who never bowed to convention to soften for one man that was love in its purest form. No one knew how much she loved him, but everyone knew she loved no one else. And Spencer, though never promising her a future, kept returning to the screen with her again and again. Because maybe he too knew in a world of change, the only constant was the way she looked at him. When two people have shared enough time together, they begin to speak without words. Katharine and Spencer did just that. They didn't need flowers. They didn't say, "I love you" at night. They just needed a scarf hung in the right place, a perfectly strong cup of coffee, a light touch of the hand between scenes, to say, "I'm here. And I know you are too." She once told a story. Spencer had woken up in the middle of the night, sleepless, as always. He went downstairs, kept the lights off, and poured a drink, the only thing that could soothe him, even as it was quietly killing him. She didn't stop him. She just sat across the table in silence. Her eyes met his like a mirror, not judging, not pitying. And in a moment of rare vulnerability, he said softly, "Sure. Thank you for not trying to fix me." She never tried. She just stayed, like the only stillness in a life full of noise. Many women fall in love with men hoping to change them, to make them kinder, better, easier to love. Katharine didn't. She didn't fall in love with who Spencer could become. She loved the contradiction, the man who could silence a room with his performance, but couldn't sleep through the night. Whenever they filmed together, rehearsals were barely needed. He'd glance, she'd nod. The script would unfold like breath. The director of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner once said, "I didn't have to direct them. I just had to turn on the camera and let love do the rest." And that love, quiet, unadorned, unspoken, became its own language. One only they could speak. Spencer never spoke publicly about her, and Katharine never asked him to. Even in her memoir decades later, she gave him one chapter. No scandal, no secrets. Just this: he was part of me. And I think if I say too much, I might ruin something sacred. She knew some loves weren't meant to be shouted. They were meant to be lived fully, quietly, and long enough that nothing could take their place. By 1967, Spencer's body had grown frail. His heart, his sleep, and the years had worn him down like an old tree bending in the wind. He rarely acted. He rarely appeared. But when Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was offered to him, he said yes, on one condition: Katharine has to be in it. And she came. It would be their final film, a story about change tolerance and choosing love over tradition, so much like their own lives. Spencer was so weak the crew adjusted every schedule around him. But in every scene when he looked into Katharine's eyes, he was still Spencer, the witty, soulful, quietly intense man she had loved for nearly 30 years. There was a final scene, his last on film. He sat at the dinner table delivering a long, moving monologue, his gaze fixed on her. And it wasn't just her character who was listening. It was her, the woman who had sat beside him for decades, with no title, no legal name, but who had never once left. When the scene ended, no one moved. Katharine bowed her head and hid her face behind her hands. Then she walked off set and cried in front of everyone for the first time. 12 days later, Spencer Tracy passed away in his own home, while Katharine was in the kitchen making him tea. They never filmed another scene. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner premiered after his death and brought Katharine an Oscar. She didn't attend the ceremony. She didn't give interviews. She wrote in a letter to a friend, "I had everything I needed. I stood beside him in his final performance, and I heard him say, 'I love you,' not in words, but in glances, in lines, in the way he stayed alive just long enough to finish it. She didn't need anything more." When Spencer Tracy died, Katharine did not attend the funeral. She didn't send flowers. She didn't speak. She simply disappeared. Years later, when asked, "Why didn't you go to his funeral?" she answered, her voice calm but aching, "I couldn't. I wasn't his wife. I didn't want to cause confusion. The woman who once defied all of Hollywood didn't walk into that room out of respect for a title that was never hers. But everyone knew in his heart she was everything." After his death, Katharine didn't act for 5 years, not because she lost interest, but because no one was left to share the frame with. Those closest to her said she would sit for hours at her Connecticut home, staring out at the sea, where they had once rowed together every summer. She rarely spoke of him. In her memoir published nearly 25 years after his death, she finally wrote about him in pages slow and soft, as if her hands trembled not from age, but from a heart that had never quite healed. She wrote, "Spencer was never easy to love, but he was the only man who ever made me feel like a woman." And in that one sentence, their love story was complete. It didn't need a wedding. It only needed to be true. It didn't need to be official. It only needed to be lived. She kept their love as something that never belonged to Hollywood. No one could recreate it. No one could rewrite it. Only she could carry it quietly to the end. Katharine Hepburn lived more than 3 decades after Spencer's death. She had time to fall in love again, to marry, to live a different life if she had wanted to. But she didn't. People asked her, "Why didn't you marry? Why no children?" She answered without hesitation, without sorrow, like someone who had known the truth for years. "I didn't choose this path because I didn't believe in love. I chose it because I had enough love already. I didn't need more to feel complete. Many wouldn't understand. They believed a woman needed a home, a husband, children to be fulfilled. But Katharine, who once walked off easy roles to protect her dignity, who stood tall where others shrank, needed none of that. She once said, "I think women should be true to themselves. If you want children, have them. If you want to work, do it. But don't let anyone else tell you what fulfillment looks like." She didn't live to please others, not even Spencer. But she loved him in a way that never demanded, not through vows, but presence, not on paper, but through a life quietly shared. In her oceanside home in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, there weren't many photos of her and Spencer. But there was one small drawer with letters, never sent faded photographs, and a chipped teacup he used every morning when he visited. She never put those things on display, never mentioned them in interviews. They just remained proof of a great love that needed no witness. And until her last breath, when her hands trembled and her eyes dimmed, she stayed alone. But never lonely. She never once said, "I regret." Because regret only comes when love goes unspoken. And she had loved a lifetime's worth, with silence, faithfulness, and grace. When Katharine Hepburn died in June 2003, she lay in her familiar room facing the ocean. There were no cameras, no spotlights, no applause. But in the hearts of millions, she remained the one woman Hollywood never truly captured. They called her a feminist icon, the greatest actress of her time, the woman with 4 Oscars, who never once accepted them in person. But if we could say one thing above all, she loved and never needed that love to carry her name. Katharine lived without labels, and because of that, the love between her and Spencer transcended every definition. It didn't end with a divorce decree. It didn't leave behind wedding portraits. It ended with a look of final scene and a morning where she was making tea and he slipped away. No one wrote their script, but even if someone had, it wouldn't have been as beautiful as the one they lived. She once said, "I never needed him to be mine in front of the world. I only needed him to know that when he hurt, I'd be there." And maybe that's what love truly is. Not something that needs to win. Not something that needs blessings. Not even something that needs results. Just one person who remembers. Long enough, deep enough, warm enough that no one else could ever take their place. More than 20 years have passed since Katharine Hepburn closed her eyes. But those who knew her name, those who saw the way she looked at Spencer Tracy on screen, they understand some love stories don't need to be spoken aloud, because they were already lived like a poem without rhyme. That makes your heart go still every time you remember it. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that you didn't need to call it by name, didn't need to hold it tight, and yet felt completely full inside, then you'll understand why Katharine Hepburn never married, and never once was truly alone.